Hello and welcome to the fifth episode of the NetScaler podcast. My name is Brian Huhn, and I'm joined in person by my co-host Jason Poole today. Together, we're going to deep dive into the ins and outs of application delivery and security, explore stories from the industry, and learn about the challenges that face IT teams and how they overcome them. Jason, can you introduce our guests for today?
Sure. Thanks, Brian. In this month's podcast, we're going to take a look at the history of NetScaler, how it came about as a product and a company, what made it different and stand out from the crowd, how architectural decisions made at its inception gave it a unique position in the industry, and how those same decisions led to easier, more rapid development to meet the ever-evolving ADC market. And we're lucky to be joined today by two longtime NetScaler servants who've been around for almost from the start, I think. Anil Shetty, who's the VP of Engineering, and Dorr, who's the Director of Software Engineering. Gentlemen, welcome to the podcast. Did I get anything wrong about the intro? Other than the Eon Clark, which I will...
Okay, it's fine.
Yeah, I think it's good.
Welcome.
Thanks for the intro. Happy to be here.
Thank you. All right. So before we get started, I wanted to say thanks for taking the time to meet with us. The history of NetScaler is fascinating, a fascinating technical story, and something I've wanted to tell for a long time. It's a story with lots of rumor and hearsay, and I want to get a definitive answer to many of my questions. So let's cast our mind back to 1998, because I think that's when NetScaler started out. What was happening in the market back then that made someone sit down and think, we need a different way to deliver applications? Anil?
In 1998, there were websites with static web pages and lots of images spinning all over. The founder, Michael Sosai, who started the company, he had his background was from Sun Microsystems, deep in networking, and he felt there was a need to protect and accelerate those websites. Back in the day, there were quite a few load balancers in the market, many ASIC based, and we'll get to how we are different from ASIC. But back in the day, we had a choice of becoming yet another load balancer or come into the market slightly differently, and we chose to come in as a web scaling and protection solution. And the strengths in the company, the roots in the company had to do with performance and scalability.
Mm-hmm.
That was really the guts of our strength, and that's how we started.
So the companies or customers out there, they needed performance and scalability.
Yes, and they needed protection for their websites, and that essentially requires performance and scale in the implementation to deliver that.
So kind of on that topic of performance, because obviously NetScaler is more than just, security nowadays. What was it that we did that helped meet that customer demand? And one step past that, what did NetScaler do that kind of helped differentiate it from the other load balancers at the time?
There were 4 decisions that were made in the late 90s, and that's why we're in the room today, why this podcast exists. Because all 4 of those decisions were foundational and created this industry anomaly of a product that has survived and thrived for a quarter century. Those 4 decisions were, number 1, they decided to build the NetScaler as a software implementation, which was contrary to a lot of the trends in the industry at the time that were ASIC focused, hardware, semiconductor implementations. Number 2, they chose to ride the Intel Pentium Xeon ecosystem. And of course, now that seems obvious, but at the time it was visionary. Number 3 is they built this baseline on top of FreeBSD. And if you look back at the late 90s, there is no alternative that would have persisted to this day, except for the continuity of the FreeBSD, a high quality Unix baseline. And the 4th decision that they made was to hire Rajiv Sinha as employee number 1.
Okay, those decisions, and I came from an ASIC-based origin way back in the day. So what was it that we did, or that NetScaler did, that made it meet those demands of performance and scalability? Because that's much harder to do when you're software-based, as you said.
Well, so I joined the NetScaler in 2000, which was pretty much the peak of the .com, and it was very hot. We had venture capital money. I came in at the same time as BB Jagadish, who was essential to the history of NetScaler, and we joined together and remain friends to this day. The initial release, the product was originally called WebScaler, and in the initial release, we were essentially selling a transmultiplexer, TCP transmultiplexer. And what we discovered is that there really was no market for a TCP transmultiplexer. And then we brought out another release, and in the next release, we brought out the load balancer capability. And that's also when we changed the colors to the epic red and black.
Yes.
And what we found in that release was that we were too late to the party, and there was no market for a new load balancer. Then when it was 2001. And that the market and the economic environment was deteriorating around us. And then we followed that up with a critical release in the summer of 2002. And we produced what's called the Rainier baseline. And that functionality combined the load balancer with the crypto acceleration in hardware and compression. And that feature set led Citrix to buy us out a few years later for $250 million. So it was really the Rainier baseline in the summer of 2002 that made the NetScaler a viable product that persists to this day.
Right. So, and we'll come to the Citrix piece in a moment. I want to spend some time on that. But ultimately, you're saying that the multiplexing, which is still in the product today,
Correct.
Yep.
the load balancing and the SSL offload was the thing that pushed it over the edge, that made it different and helped it. But okay, so if we take that, and lots of others started to bring that in, but what was fundamental to the development of NetScaler? You mentioned the software-centric piece, but how does that then translate into giving you the performance that you require? Because it's very much harder to do in software than in hardware, right?
Well, the implementation was unique in the sense it was a in-kernel packet engine. And it was the intellectual property of FreeBSD baseline that made that implementation possible without having to open source it. And there's a lot of focus on optimization. And also the industry tended at the time, if you go back to the late 90s, people would offer single function boxes of various kinds. There'd be, a load balancer, there'd be a crypto engine, there'd be a compression box, and so on. But what we did in 2002 was we consolidated all those functions into a single system. And this is an industry trend that persists to this day, which is continual consolidation. So customers are seeking the functionality, but if you can consolidate multiple systems into one, you're giving them a financial advantage. And then also we were riding the performance curve of the Pentium Xeon.
Right. And the performance of the Pentium Xeon, so as Intel introduced faster processors, NetScaler got faster and better, right? That's what we're saying?
Correct.
And just to add to that, see, it's one thing to just ride the Intel curve, but it's another thing to also recognize how we can truly tap and differentiate with the implementation of use of Intel technology. And that's where really a lot of time, energy, and focus went in the early days. Simple things like when a packet comes in, we were one of the first ones to recognize some of these bottlenecks in the Intel architecture. The processor itself could be very fast, but it's really the time it takes to fetch data from the main memory that slows down the overall processing. Okay. So we had some really focused effort in optimizing the packet through the Intel pipeline and through our stack. That's number one. Number two, we recognized really early on that, yes, you can ride on Intel, but it's really the networking subsystem that makes the overall engine go fast. Mm-hmm. So we implemented our own L2 to L7 stack. And, things like zero copy, things like taking care of interrupts by disabling them, things like doing prefetching when needed, all of those micro optimizations ultimately led to really the scale and performance that the NetScaler is known for today, right? And just to build that on, and to Dorr's point earlier, when we started going in front of these applications, we noticed there were several point products. So that's when we decided, you know what, let's just bring compression in the box. Let's bring SSL offload in the box. Let's do load balancing. And it's really some of these things slowly, one by one, when customers realized, hey, this is a powerful box, can do many things, we are kind of almost invented application delivery controller as a category because it's really a multifunction box that can do many things.
So we were an ADC before there was an ADC, so to speak, right?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. And one thing that I've thought about this is, when I was working in 2000 in load balancing, it was all ASICs, as you know, at the time before I was introduced to NetScaler. One of the things was it was very good at layer 4. It wasn't so great at layer 7. It had some, but it was a slower path, if you will. And what I've seen in the industry is like customers want more granular decision making. Is that something that NetScaler lends itself to because it's software focused?
Absolutely. And if I may add, so when we launched in the industry first, and there were, as I said, there were the load balancers, very ASIC based load balancers. Back in the day, ArrowPoint was one. Altion is another one. They no longer exist in the market today. But these were all ASIC-based load balancer, very good at layer 4 processing. But the moment you open up and try to do any layer 7 processing, the performance will just fall off the cliff. With NetScaler, everything was done in software, as I explained before, highly optimized and tuned for packet processing. So for us, layer 4 and layer 7 were just as finely tuned. And with us, when you enable layer 7, performance will maybe take a slight dip, but not as much like when you move with the ASIC-based solution, when you go from ASIC to main processor. Right? So that again comes back to the root of the company, the strength of the company. The performance and scale is really in our DNA. And that's really how we get all the performance.
And in that era, our code base was continually getting faster and continually adapting to new features and new opportunities. The financial backdrop of the dot-com crash led to the tech industry. By 2002, 2003, we're in a flat bottom. It's starting to recover. A lot of companies failed. It's important to note that one of the things that PB Jagadish did, and it's again a visionary decision, was to initiate the Bangalore office. And the Bangalore office and the leverage that provided essentially allowed us to survive when other companies failed. And NetScaler instituted a global engineering culture at that time and successfully nurtured that. And that was one of the crown jewels that Citrix acquired a few years later, because Citrix only had sales offices in India. And they got this massive, gorgeous, effective engineering organization in Bangalore. And eventually all of the Citrix portfolio wound up in there. So that was critical to survival. But also at this time, when you look at 2003, 2004 in this window, all the systems on the market at that time were 1 gig systems, right? This predates the transition to the 10 gig interface. And we had a system in software that was line rate. And of course, at that time, we were part of a venture capital portfolio. We were not publicly traded. And as is normal, the venture capitalists would take their portfolio and they would bring them and attempt to cross-fertilize. And so we had a constant parade of these people coming to see us. And almost all of those were hardware solutions. And we'd listen to them and they'd say, well, we have a goal. We're building this ASIC and it's going to do network processing. And we'd listen and we'd say, well, what's your performance target? And they'd say line rate, 1 gig. And we'd say, well, would you like to step in our lab? We have a 1 gig box now in software on the market. And then we'd never see them again because their forecast was 18 months out.
Yeah.
So with the semiconductors, it's a brittle implementation. You get to a certain level of capability and performance, and then you sell that until you can innovate again. but we're constantly innovating our software baseline to this day. And at that time, that allowed us to be more opportunistic and to continually improve performance.
So we've talked a good amount about, what really was the secret sauce of NetScaler, but I'm wondering kind of how this played in the market, helped us survive, the tech bubble crash. So without having to name any names, do you have any examples of how we were able to deliver value to a customer, really, set ourselves apart?
Well, I think you were the one who was intimately involved with the early, very large customer and successfully won that.
Yeah. So sure. We really got a start with what I'm calling as web and SaaS companies. These are really large .com companies from 2000s, right? And we had a major success with one of the really top popular search company, and from there, our name got recommended to another big cloud provider. That's how we really got a name. It's again at the roots of it was performance, observability, the rich stack that we had that is able to do all of the function that we described earlier at line rate. And word of mouth, right? So that's really how we got our start, and we really became very well known in web and SaaS and internet and .com companies.
And so these companies literally relied on NetScaler to deliver their business, right?
That's correct.
Yeah.
That's correct.
And part of the reason we won those accounts is because we were able to optimize to their use case. So it took us actually quite some time to convince them that we belonged in their networks.
Mm-hmm.
And Anil was especially important spearheading that customer acquisition. That took quite a bit of work at that time.
Just as a interesting data point, right? So as we're talking to one of these really large players, they actually had the team of engineers come in, and we were really studying startup back then, a team of like 15, 20 engineers. So we actually had the team come in and look at a code, believe it or not. That never really happened. And we're fine, we're sure we want a lucky break. And then they inspected the code, and then they said, look, you guys are good to go. Now show us what you can do. And sure enough, the product worked, and we got one customer from there. We got another one, and that's how we built a name for ourselves in the internet.com space.
So just curious to flesh out that story a little bit more. What did, what did the customer situation look like, say, before and after the NetScaler implementation? Like, what did we really change for them?
So we clearly provided all of the application delivery function that we talked about. But from a customer point of view, they instantly get protection, ability to deliver those functions at line rate. And there was a really nice side benefit that most customers were surprised by, and that is with our connection multiplexing and web multiplexing technology. We were one of the first ones to do that. While providing these ADC functions, we were also multiplexing and reusing connections to the backend server. The net result of that was download used to happen much faster. Now I'm going to get a little geeky on this. As you reuse and multiplex TCP connections, there's something called as congestion control algorithm that expands and is able to deliver content much faster to the client. And that's truly enabled by the connection to use technology that we were one of the first ones to bring to market. We even have a patent on it. And that's really what, from a customer point of view, they got all the functions and they got this nice side benefit where the end user experience was dramatically better.
Did it reduce the number of servers they needed at the back end because of the multiplexing?
Absolutely. It reduced the load on the backend server.
So probably there's a big financial saving in that as well, right?
Yeah. Which was part of the value proposition that we brought in that environment and allowed us to thrive.
So I want to just, in the interest of time, we could spend all day just talking about this, but I want to switch around now to the Citrix years as well. So in 2005, NetScaler was acquired by Citrix. And one of the myths that surrounds this purchase was that Citrix wanted it to front-end Citrix environments. And although that did happen, I have to think that there was more to it than that.
It took us actually quite some time to get this integrated into the Citrix use case. My understanding of the negotiations is that when they began their process of due diligence, they actually were surprised to learn that we had an SSL VPN capability.
Mm-hmm.
They were in the process of acquiring another company in that space. And then say, oh, you do that too. How about that? Eventually that stuff got integrated with Citrix, and that particular use case has been very successful, of course, over the past 15 years, but it took actually multiple years of traction. Citrix acquisition of NetScaler in the beginning we had two very foreign cultures from the point of view of an engineering integration.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we were Unix based. We were focused on the new economy, focused on the .com world, very successful at that environment. Citrix was very much an enterprise Windows centric company, and there was not a lot of synergy in terms of the engineering environment. To their credit, they let us be ourselves. And financially, we were allowed to thrive and get traction. And at the same time of that acquisition, there was some industry trends that were in motion that were going to require us to move very quickly over the first half a dozen years as being part of the Citrix portfolio. And two of those were the adoption of 10 gig, which you expressed an interest in earlier, but also the transition from a single processor to multi-core. And it was actually Rajiv Sinha way back in 2002 who came to me and talked to me and said, we're going to have to go multi-core at some point. And my immediate response to him was, you're going to have to upgrade this operating system. And so that began our journey through the versions of FreeBSD. And we went from FreeBSD 2.2.5 in the late 90s to FreeBSD 4.4 to FreeBSD 4.9 to FreeBSD 6.3. Ultimately, FreeBSD 6.3 was required for us to complete the journey to multi-core. And that took us 6 or 7 years. And Rajiv foresaw the need to accomplish that transition. And the other thing that Citrix did, which was really impressive and visionary to me, was when they first acquired us, they entered into negotiations. I'm sure you remember and were part of this, about what do you guys really think you need to succeed in the market? And the response that PV and the NetScaler leadership gave back to Citrix was, you need to acquire a company called Terrace. You need to add Web App Firewall, what ultimately became Web App Firewall. At the time, it was called App Firewall. You need to add layer 7 firewall capability to this system. And so they went out and did that. They went out and bought another company, and the combined product, which came to market over the early years after the acquisition, is still a market driver today and a critical element of the success of the NetScaler.
So diving a bit more into that, the things that NetScaler got from this acquisition being merged with Citrix, was there anything else aside from those, extra mergers that, we gained from this deal?
Actually, that team was really strong. The Terrace team, they had good leadership. They had a lot of good engineers. The people they brought in, some of them are with NetScaler to this day, but the combined engineering team led us to solve multiple critical problems and contributed to our transition out of the single core to the multi-core implementation. And the Valley literally is littered with the bones of products that knew they had to make that transition and failed. Yeah. Right? There's bones all over this valley of companies that couldn't make that transition, and we were able to do it. And the folks that came in as part of the Terrace acquisition have deserve credit for their contribution. It was a combined effort.
And from a customer point of view, prior to the acquisition, we were primarily known on the internet and .com side. But with Citrix, we got exposure to a lot of enterprise customers. And so that was another big plus that we got through Citrix acquisition.
What did we have to learn from that? Is there I guess there's a difference between what the customers want, certainly in terms of perhaps the scale of what they want. But
Yeah, it's just definitely enterprise customers don't have the same scale requirement as a .com customer would. It's just really more about feature richness, different types of health checks, applications that we support, more observability, and then that's where we started strengthening our muscles.
so
And
really
one of
bringing
those
the consolidation piece is
Consolidation.
probably very strong, which lends itself to the whole architecture that we talked about earlier, right?
That's correct. And the other thing is, Citrix back then and even today is a leader in virtual apps and desktops, right? So Citrix recognized really early on that customers have multiple ways they deploy their application. They deploy their application remotely, which is where virtual apps and desktops come, and sometimes they also prefer to access it directly natively on web. So just recognizing that trend and offering this choice to our customers, because we really are in a business where you want to give this choice to customers, whether you want to deploy it virtually in data centers so that it becomes easier for you to manage all the security posture, or if you want to access it directly through web. And that's where the NetScaler piece comes in for providing all of the web acceleration and the web capabilities that we just discussed, and also providing the remote access for your employees that are accessing these applications from home. So that was Citrix's vision when they acquired us in 2005.
Right. So connecting to that, the Citrix environments, we now know that NetScaler has been very successful in front of these environments. What were some of the main integrations that kind of drove, starting that?
Into the Citrix world.
Yeah.
NetScaler into the Citrix. And we touched on it, but how did that go?
So the first use case was really how can we make the overall virtual apps and desktop experience better? And how do we provide access to employees who are at home to their virtual apps and desktops, right? And just enhance the overall user experience for launching an application, launching a desktop. And that's when NetScaler piece fit in. NetScaler provided remote access. NetScaler did better integration with all of the virtual apps and desktop components, much better than any of the other vendors, in the market. And that was really the start. That's how we got into all of the enterprise customers. And from there, we said, look, Mr. Customer, this device is the best when it comes to virtual apps and desktop experience, but it can do a whole lot more. And that's where all of the EDC functions, we started expanding into the enterprise accounts with those EDC functions.
Right, but and great with web applications. But one of the things we discussed last month with Stephen was about deploying it in front of Citrix environments, and for the best will in the world, what NetScaler does for web applications, Citrix is not a web application when it's being delivered. It's this ICA proxy, ICA protocol. How on earth did you manage to get to look inside that?
So we did get access to the ICA, and that gave us a competitive advantage because it's a proprietary protocol, and we were able to implement and optimize to the internals. And there's also, Citrix had traditionally also been in remote access, right? And so the ICA optimization, where we had a competitive advantage, also there was synergy between the SSL VPN and what ultimately became known as Access Gateway. And in the NetScaler, we also had global load balancing. So GSLB in combination with SSL VPN solutions and ICA optimization gave us the ability to take Citrix technology and make it available to a global workforce, right, with reliability and high performance that other implementations couldn't match.
Thank you, everyone, for watching this extra special episode of the NetScaler podcast. Our discussion with Anil and Dorr will continue in a part 2 of this episode, which will be released in 2 weeks' time. So keep an eye out for the exciting conclusion, where we'll discuss more of what makes NetScaler truly unique, as well as our outlook on the future of both the company and industry. You can find the audio version of this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. And you can watch the video version of this interview on YouTube. And if you're already here, leave us a comment on what you thought and hit that subscribe button so you know when part 2 of this interview comes out. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you back in 2 weeks.